The individual recognized throughout history as King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India was born at White Lodge, Richmond Park in Surrey, England, on June 23, 1894. George, the preeminent progeny of Edward, Prince of Wales, the progeny and successor apparent of Queen Victoria of Britain, was his father. Given that Victoria had entered her mid-70s at the time of Edward's birth in 1894, it was evident that her grandson, Edward's grandfather and future Edward VII, Prince of Wales, would succeed her in the near future. Young Edward would be positioned as the second in line to the throne should that circumstance arise, which it did shortly after Victoria passed away in January 1901. The maternal figure of young Edward was Mary of Teck, who was descended from the senior German Duke of Teck. Mary and George had a total of 6 children, 5 of whom were girls and 1 were males. Although Edward was the eldest, the subsequent eldest child, a boy named Albert after Victoria's long-deceased husband, from whom she had never completely recovered, was nearly as significant as the years passed. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David was his full name, but in his adolescence, he was universally known as David within his family. Edward was conditioned from an early age to aspire to the position of monarch. Undoubtedly, it took him decades to ascend to the monarchy. However, due to fortuitous demise and illness, it was occasionally possible for an heir apparent to the throne, such as Edward, to ascend at an exceptionally tender age. Although his parents adopted a somewhat remote and authoritative approach to parenting, the household was not entirely negative. However, Edward developed a sense of caution towards his father's irrational outbursts concerning matters of little consequence. Subsequent to that, he documented in his memoirs that he had felt neglected and that his formative years had imbued within him a determination to postpone parenthood, something he never did. Despite the fact that his intellect was hardly prodigious, Edward gained a wider reputation during his youth for his effortless charisma, which enabled him to freely interact with individuals of various social classes. He and his siblings received the majority of their early education at home, at York Cottage at Sandringham and at Frogmore near Windsor Castle. Prince Edward was admitted to the Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight as he approached adolescence. Subsequently, he advanced to the Royal Naval College before being assigned to the HMS Britannia. This training was nearly indistinguishable from that which his father had received during his youth, and it has continued to be a customary practice for royal monarchs ever since. Edward, despite being the heir apparent to the monarchy, was not particularly shielded during his youth in the Navy and was subjected to bullying. Beyond that, his development was comparatively restricted. His intellectual development and ascent to a scholarly position were not facilitated through formal education, unlike his predecessors during the 17th or 18th centuries. He developed an intellectually limited worldview as a consequence. This intellectual immaturity became even more worrisome in May 1910, when, following his grandfather's death, his father ascended to the monarchy, making 15-year-old Edward the heir apparent. As per custom, he was bestowed with the title of Prince of Wales shortly thereafter and, notwithstanding his youth, was swiftly entangled in public affairs. In the early 1910s, Edward's sporadic attendance at public events was interspersed with academic pursuits at the University of Oxford, which were mandated by his father. However, Edward demonstrated a lack of interest in learning and was even more content with the unrest that beset Europe near the conclusion of his sojourn there. During the summer of 1914, Europe was hit by conflict. Decades had passed since the formation of a formidable adversary to Britain due to the destabilizing effects of a unified Germany in the 1870s, which also altered the balance of power in Central Europe. Additional challenges that further complicated the situation were competition for colonial possessions in Africa and intense nationalist sentiment in the Balkans, where the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires vied for dominion over the Ottoman Empire's decline. The spark that ignited the war was ultimately a regional crisis that occurred in this location during the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the successor to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the hands of a Serb nationalist. Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were engaged in hostilities with Britain, France, and Russia during the last week of July and the first week of August. Throughout what became known as the First World War, the British maintained their primary front in northern France, where they and the French were quickly ensnared in German-led attritional trench warfare. Prince Edward and others were enlisted as officers in the army as a demonstration of royal family solidarity with the millions of British men who were being conscripted and sent to fight in France at the time. In the final days of July 1914, Edward was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards. He adapted exceptionally well to military service and discovered that he derived satisfaction from the camaraderie that he had not experienced during his academic pursuits. It is difficult, nevertheless, to assert that his wartime experience was genuine. It was impossible to position Edward, along with other senior members of the royal family or major noble lines, in a perilous situation where they could be apprehended or killed. Therefore, he was essentially accompanied by his comrades stationed in various positions throughout northern France for the majority of the subsequent 4 years. Certain of these were merely symbolic, such as when he was dispatched to meet with French generals as a sort of royal ambassador. However, his purported inspection of British Army bases along the Western Front is believed to have significantly boosted morale on the front. A prince and a member of the royal family were both present and actively participating in their respective military service. Indeed, Edward did encounter peril during the war on 1 or 2 occasions, notwithstanding the thorough measures implemented. Notably, this occurred when his vehicle was involved in a collision in northern France and his chauffeur perished in the detonation of artillery. Furthermore, his sphere of endeavors transcended France, as evidenced by his 1916 sojourn to the Middle East, where he cordially received the British allies from Australia and New Zealand. An additional way in which the conflict was consequential would have a negligible effect on Edward and his family for decades. The royal dynasty was initially referred to as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This was instituted in 1901 subsequent to King Edward VII's succession, thereby concluding the House of Hanover's nearly 200-year reign over Britain. Nevertheless, during the First World War, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha moniker, bestowed due to the profound ties between the British royal family and numerous high-ranking royal lineages in Germany, proved to be problematic. It served as a constant reminder to an excessive number of individuals that the royal family had substantial German ancestry, and that George V was in fact the first cousin of German Kaiser Wilhelm II. It became especially evident that retaining the royal title was untenable in 1917, when German bombers named Gotha bombers began dumping bombs on London. As a result, the royal house underwent a name change in July 1917 to become known as the House of Windsor. This decision was primarily influenced by the enduring connections that existed between the English monarchy and Windsor Castle, situated to the west of London. The war was ultimately declared a success in November 1918, rendering this name alteration largely inconsequential thereafter. However, over time, the new Windsor appellation would become inextricably linked with Edward. The conclusion of the war presented Edward with the opportunity to decide whether or not to wed and have an heir in order to ensure the continuation of the line of succession. However, in contrast to the majority of previous monarchs, Edward's father was amenable to granting Edward autonomy over his matrimonial matters. Furthermore, by the late 1910s and 1920s, there was a growing British public sentiment that the prince's choice of future queen should be influenced by some stage of mutual affection. Likewise, Edward was not in a hurry. In contrast, during the 1920s, when the economic expansion and social decadence supplanted the violence and turmoil of the 1910s, Edward became a frequent patron of London's dance halls and nightclubs, where an entourage formed around the future monarch. Additionally, he initiated a romantic relationship with Winifred Dudley Ward, an individual who was married to William Dudley Ward, the grandson of Lord Esher in the British nobility, and had 2 young children. In the 1920s, following Ward's eventual divorce from Edward, the affair escalated to an extremely serious level, despite the fact that Edward saw a number of other women intermittently during this time. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Ward had finalized her divorce from her first spouse, their relationship failed to culminate in matrimony and was ultimately severed by Edward in 1934. In the 1920s, this predilection for the affluent lifestyle and Edward's complicated romantic life caused concern among the royals and the government. Edward's habits and demeanor, which were perceived as quasi-egalitarian, further compounded the situation. The prince, who had become accustomed to seeking common ground with rank-and-file soldiers during his military service during the war, maintained these efforts during imperial visits to Canada and other regions in the 1920s. His approachable nature towards commoners might have been regarded favorably by members of the royal family during the interwar period, nearly a century ago. However, this behavior was met with disapproval from the realm's nobles, senior politicians, and royals. Furthermore, Edward was perceived by many as a monarch who might attempt to exercise an excessive amount of political independence upon assuming the throne, as opposed to a figure who would merely perform the ceremonial duties of monarchy, as had been the case in England since the early 18th century. Thus, senior political circles were becoming increasingly concerned about the prince's conduct and attitudes as early as the late 1920s. These concerns were doubtless articulated in private during the months of 1928 and 1929, when King George suffered from a severe illness that lasted several months. Although he recovered and continued to rule for a number of years, ominous indications pointed to a future conflict between his successor and the political realm. Edward met the woman in the early 1930s who would have a profound impact on the remainder of his life. Bessie Wallace Warfield was the given name of Pennsylvania-born American socialite Wallis Simpson. Having been raised in Baltimore for 2 years prior to Edward, she and her mother had received financial assistance from affluent extended relatives following the demise of her father when they were children. She wed Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., an American Air Force pilot, in 1916. Although the matrimonial union endured for more than 10 years, it was marked by considerable estrangement well in advance of their final divorce in 1927. Ernest Simpson, an American by birth who had established extensive business connections in Britain, was wed to Wallace the following year. The Simpsons had established a predominant residence in England during the early 1930s, owing to Wallace's business transactions, which facilitated his advancement in high society circles. However, much of their social ascent was illusory, and Ernest Simpson's business dealings had encountered significant difficulties in the wake of the 1929 Wall Street crash and the subsequent Great Depression. This undoubtedly caused some tension in his and Wallace's marriage during the early 1930s, when she met Prince Edward for the first time. A pivotal year in the evolution of the Prince and Wallis Simpson's relationship occurred in 1934. He resolved to cease his sporadic affairs with Frieda Dudley Ward and other mistresses, including Lady Furness, in that year. Remarkably, his captivation with Mrs. Simpson appears to have originated from the fact that she occupied the more dominant position in their relationship. Edward retained an infantile demeanor well into his adult years, while Simpson appeared to have absolute control over the prince, according to numerous mid-1930s reports. Edward was obviously captivated by her, and it is apparent that he had made up his mind to wed Simpson by 1934 or 1935, with the intention of elevating her to the position of queen consort in the future. However, preliminary indications suggested that this would not become feasible. Edward's father and mother were unimpressed when he introduced his American companion to them. In fact, beginning in 1935, special branch police were assigned to monitor the couple's movements. There were two significant matters under consideration. Firstly, Simpson's status as a divorcée raised religious and moral objections, as it would be impermissible for the future King of England to wed and for her to ascend to the throne. Concerned observers of the mid-1930s associated Simpson's American heritage with allegations that she exerted an undue amount of influence over Edward. Before too long, the question of who would become queen consort became urgent. At the age of 70, King George V passed away on January 20, 1936, and the following day, Edward was proclaimed King Edward VIII. There were initially positive indications. George V had endured a protracted period of illness, during which his chronic respiratory issues frequently impeded his capacity to perform the duties of monarch. Furthermore, he was widely regarded as an archaic individual by the general public, appearing to have originated in the late 19th century rather than the burgeoning era of the interwar period. This public jubilation for a new monarch following the end of a lengthy reign was not an unprecedented occurrence in British politics. However, it proved to be unfounded in the case of Edward. Almost no consideration appears to have gone into how the new monarch would govern upon succeeding his father. However, it became immediately apparent that Edward was diametrically opposed to his father in that he had little concern for the practical affairs of state. He would pay minimal heed to documents and state papers that ministers would present to him. On the contrary, he appeared content to continue living his life in London in the same manner as before, which included maintaining an active social life. What they observed troubled many in Westminster and elsewhere within weeks. The demise of George V occurred during a period of substantial political difficulty on a global scale, which worsened Edward's preoccupation. Immensity characterized the First World War's legacy. The Russian Revolution, which erupted in 1917 in Eastern Europe, culminated in the Soviet Union's rise to global prominence following decades of internal strife. Notably, this Soviet Union was characterized by its ideological opposition to nations such as Britain. The Imperial Japanese Empire was the prevailing power in the Far East and had initiated aggressive expansion on the Asian continent in 1931 with the conquest of the Chinese province of Manchuria several years prior. After years of instability, Spain was on the verge of descending into a vicious civil war in Western Europe, while fascist regimes and authoritarian governments had acquired power in countries such as Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The expansion of extremist ideology was further exacerbated by the economic crisis that commenced in 1929 with the Wall Street crash and culminated in the early 1930s with years of severe economic depression. Britain was a bastion of relative stability in this environment. As monarch, Edward would be responsible for preserving this and the British Empire in Africa and India. But among all the challenges that Europe was facing, none was as formidable as the one presented by Germany. The demoralizing and destabilizing effects of the terms of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, which were imposed by Great Britain and France, pervaded the nation. As a result, substantial portions of formerly German territory were reassigned to the country's neighbors, enormous financial reparations were imposed, and the military was severely constrained. However, by the mid-1920s, the German Republic had emerged from a protracted period of turmoil in the late 1910s and early 1920s and had become the cultural epicenter of the continent. The economic crisis that struck Germany in particular hard in the late 1920s and early 1930s, with no exception. Following years of electoral success, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, an extremist organization, was able to seize power in early 1933. It was commanded by Adolf Hitler. In violation of the Treaty of Versailles, they initiated aggressive armament in the 12 months preceding Edward's accession and quickly transformed Germany into a one-party dictatorship. An anticipation might have held that Edward's tenure would be marked by resistance against Nazi aggression. However, circumstances swiftly transpired to ensure its transient nature, and Edward soon formed an alliance with the Germans that has since cast a pall over his entire life. Edward was rumored to have harbored ties to factions within the Nazi regime in Germany, a matter that would quickly generate unfathomable controversy. However, during the initial months of his tenure, his relationship with Mrs. Simpson was the more pressing concern. The degree of unease that government ministers in London began to feel when foreign newspapers began reporting the new monarch and Simpson's vacation on a yacht in the Mediterranean shortly after he ascended to power, although the precise extent of the trouble this would cause was initially unknown. As soon as it became apparent that Wallis Simpson and her second spouse were nearing the conclusion of their divorce proceedings, the administration of Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was compelled to take action. Baldwin did not possess an inherent propensity for interventionism in such matters. It was commonly believed that he was a prime minister who vacillated and protracted the process of reaching significant decisions to an unhealthy degree. Furthermore, he had a fondness for Edward on a personal level and was not particularly eager to intervene in their dispute regarding the prospect of his matrimonial union. He exhibited considerable delay in his request, but ultimately resolved to meet with the king on October 20, 1936. This may have been due to the fact that he had become aware of Wallace's decision to finalize the divorce of her long-suffering spouse a few days prior. On their encounter on October 20, Baldwin apprised the king that a press embargo imposed at that moment in observance of a new coronation and pertaining to the newly installed monarch was about to come to an end. It would be impossible to prevent newspapers and the general public from speculating ceaselessly about the king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson and whether he intended to wed her after her divorce once this information became public. As a result, he recommended to the monarch that Wallace postpone the immediate finalization of her divorce and remain absent from Britain for a period of time, allowing for a more comprehensive discussion among all pertinent parties regarding the subject. Baldwin was dissuaded by the king's assertion that Wallace's marital status was an intimate matter, despite the fact that her divorce would undoubtedly have far-reaching consequences for British public life should she remarry the monarch. From there, everything spiraled out of control. 1 week later, on October 27, Wallace successfully executed her divorce decree. However, due to prevailing legislation at the time, she would be ineligible to remarry for more than 6 months. Edward, who had not yet been crowned due to ongoing preparations for his consecration, inaugurated a new parliament a week later. Without his knowledge, the government had already initiated communication with his brother, the Duke of York, in an effort to prepare him for the possibility of succeeding him in the event that the divorce matter necessitated his abdication. Baldwin reconvened his meeting with the monarch on November 16. Edward disclosed for the first time to a high-ranking government official during this audience his intention to wed Wallace the subsequent summer, as soon as it became lawful to do so. At that juncture, Baldwin's administration initiated the process of soliciting viewpoints from both the British populace and the Dominion states that remained under British Empire governance. These indicated that the notion of a monarch crowning a woman who had been divorced twice would be met with intense hostility, primarily due to religious and moral considerations. Baldwin was also cognizant of the fact that institutions like the Church of England would be particularly antagonistic within the borders of Britain. Nevertheless, Baldwin was presented with an intriguing escape route by Edward, who declared that he would abdicate instead of reject Wallace if the government was determined to prevent him from wedlock to her. By late November 18, he had duly notified his immediate family members of the aforementioned information. Following that, a period of relative inactivity ensued for the better part of 2 weeks, during which the most significant development was the conception of a plan for Edward and Wallace to engage into a morganatic marriage in which she would become his wife but not the Queen Consort. However, such a course of action would have necessitated a parliamentary decree and would have subjected the monarchy to extensive parliamentary debate. Neither the government nor the royal family would have approved of such a development. The resolution of the escalating constitutional crisis transpired expeditiously. Baldwin initiated consultations with the cabinet and the secretaries of the dominions during the final days of November. By early December, it had become evident that there was widespread opposition to Edward's continuation as monarch on the condition that he wed Wallace. Moreover, by that time, press secrecy had broken down and the subject was becoming increasingly widely discussed. Wallace departed temporarily to France on December 3 in order to evade explicit press speculation. However, this did not appease Baldwin's government, which was now adamant that Edward relinquish the throne if he was to wed Simpson. Exactly 1 week later, on December 10, Edward signed the official instrument, disregarding the advice of numerous individuals, including Winston Churchill, who advised him to assert his monarchical rights. Royal Highness Edward VIII formally renounced his monarchical reign on December 11, 1936. It was the briefest tenure of an English monarch since the late 15th century, lasting only 327 days. Edward's address to the nation, during which he declared that he was willingly relinquishing his crown to wed the woman he loved and that the government had not coerced him into doing so, was regarded as a zenith moment for him. It was also regarded as a dignified and statesmanlike moment. In the years that followed, such conduct would not be repeated. The final matter that persisted was the designation of the former monarch and his forthcoming spouse. Edward's brother and successor proposed on December 13, 1936, the day he formally declared his abdication, that he and Wallace should henceforth hold the titles of Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the royal family name that had been established in 1917. Both the Duke and Duchess were endowed with opulent estates and a lavish salary, in addition to other ostentatious financial privileges. Nevertheless, the royal family initiated the procedure of severing ties between the ex-king and his new spouse. During the 1940s, even the monarch and other family members continued to derogatorily refer to Wallis as Mrs. Simpson. Notwithstanding the nuptials that took place on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Candé in the vicinity of Tours, France, between Edward and her, the royal family abstained from attending the nuptials, and with the exception of a congratulatory note from Baldwin's government, the event received minimal official attention in Britain. Furthermore, they would devote the majority of their lives thereafter to France, predominantly residing in Paris or a rural retreat. The remainder of the royal family was ecstatic about this exile, and the prevailing sentiment in Britain was that all individuals desired to forget Edward's brief reign in 1936 and the ensuing constitutional crisis. As part of the abdication agreement, Edward was compensated with funds to support a comparatively opulent lifestyle in Paris. These funds were utilized to purchase back several royal residences in England that he had relinquished. Amidst this period, he frequently contacted his brother, the newly crowned monarch, via telephone every few days, pleading with George VI to grant his wife the honorific, Her Royal Highness, in acknowledgement of her status as the spouse of a former British monarch. Nevertheless, this proposal was rejected, with London concerned that Wallace, despite divorcing Edward, might retain the use of the aforementioned title in the future. In the interim, the newlyweds continued to appreciate life in Paris, although they seemed to have retained the notion that this was merely a transitory separation. They promptly received correspondence from England dispelling this misconception and emphasizing that it would be to the benefit of all parties involved if they remained in Paris and avoided Britain. As Edward came to comprehend the magnitude of the rebuke he was presently experiencing, he commenced devising strategies to establish a fresh presence in the European public sphere. Despite the fact that numerous individuals may have desired to acquiesce to the public eye and lead a more private existence for a period of time in the wake of Edward's tumultuous reign, he and Wallace swiftly became entangled in the most contentious incident of the former monarch's existence. It is evident that the early 1930s were characterized by the ascendance of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to authority in Germany. Now, in the immediate aftermath of his abdication, Edward agreed to a visit to Germany. Consider this in its proper context. A considerable number of individuals traveled to Germany during the mid-1930s with the intention of observing the circumstances there and the expeditious manner in which the Nazis had restructured the nation and rescued it from the early 1930s economic crisis. For example, David Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister and Chief of State from 1916 to 1922, paid a visit to the nation in late 1936, coinciding with the domestic constitutional crisis involving Edward. When evaluating any of these visits, it is critical to bear in mind that during the mid-1930s, a significant portion of the British public perceived Hitler as a crucial barrier against the establishment of a communist state in Germany. Furthermore, individuals such as Lloyd George made their decision to travel to Germany without foreknowledge of the atrocities that the Nazis would later inflict upon Europe. Edward received an invitation to travel to Germany in the late summer of 1937 from Dr. Robert Ley, the leader of the German Labour Front. The Nazis in Germany had established the German Labour Front to stifle socialist agitation and replace trade unions. The proposition was extended by this organization, as notable individuals such as Lloyd George and Edward had been invited to the country the year prior primarily to observe how Germany had recovered from its economic difficulties and was operating its factories with the assistance of organizations like the Labour Front. Evidently motivated by a desire to revitalize his reputation in the wake of his kingship, Edward agreed. A visit to the United States was also on the itinerary, and he appeared to have formed the notion that he could serve as a catalyst for novel approaches to preventing political unrest in the Western Hemisphere, similar to the turmoil that had enveloped Spain and precipitated its civil war. Edward essentially desired to travel to Germany in order to determine how radical socialism and communism could be halted in their progression. Therefore, by the beginning of autumn 1937, he had agreed to the proposition, and the British ambassador in Berlin, George Ogilvy Forbes, was duly informed of the forthcoming visit. The excursion commenced when the Windsors arrived at Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin on the morning of October 11th. Although the excursion was advertised as a private tour and not a regal visit, not only Robert Ley, but also Joachim von Ribbentrop, who would later be appointed German foreign minister and was still the German ambassador to the United Kingdom, greeted the couple at the station. The journey continued for the following 12 days, concluding on October 23 road. Similar to the previous year, a significant portion of it was devoted to visits to German enterprises and government installations by Lloyd George's. The excursions ranged from the ordinary, like an inspection of a lighting manufacturing facility, to the ominous, most notably an excursion to a recently constructed concentration camp. The Windsors were admittedly misinformed about its true function. In addition, he paid visits to factories owned by significant German corporations, such as Krupp's, and Hitler Youth Academies. The prevailing motif was to portray an image of streamlined German industry, characterized by proficiently managed factories, a nation that had regained economic stability subsequent to the challenging early 1930s, and contented and fervent employees. Additionally, significant endeavors were undertaken to underscore the cultural affinity between Britain and Germany by playing the national anthems of both countries whenever Edward and Wallace visited an academy or factory. The overarching objective was to persuade the couple that Germany served as a paradigm for curbing the proliferation of radical socialism across the continent, and that the Nazis were inextricably linked to the British. The Windsors engaged in meetings with a number of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi regime during their sojourn. As an example, von Ribbentrop accompanied the couple on their inaugural evening in Berlin to Horch's, a renowned establishment frequented by the Nazi high command in the capital. Von Ribbentrop invited the couple along with Albert Speer, a German architect who subsequently became the Minister of Armaments, and Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda, the Minister of Propaganda. On October 14, Edward and Wallace had the more contentious opportunity to meet Hermann Göring, the newly appointed chief of the German Air Force and Hitler's second-in-command, at his hunting estate located outside of Berlin. An instance of this was during a meeting held in Göring's study, where the Nazi minister occupied a wall-mounted map of Central Europe, wherein Austria was portrayed as a constituent of Greater Germany under Nazi control. Edward did not voice any objections, notwithstanding the consequence that Germany was likely to acquire an autonomous neighbor in the near future. This, coupled with reports that the Duke and Duchess were touring armaments factories where evidently German tanks, armored vehicles, and submarines were being manufactured, and Edward saluting numerous officials with the Nazi salute while on the trip, made it easy to comprehend why apprehensions emerged and persisted in the aftermath. An even more unfavorable impression was made upon contemporaries and future generations during the Windsors' nearly 2-week sojourn in Germany. On October 22, a personal encounter between Edward and Adolf Hitler concluded the ordeal. This transpired at the Berghof, the Alpine retreat of the Nazi leader situated along the southern border of Austria and Germany. Divergent testimonies exist regarding the encounter and the subsequent discourse that ensued following Wallace's subsequent arrival. Some contend that the gathering was relatively inconsequential, as it primarily consisted of exchanging social pleasantries, a few tokens of amity between the British and German nations, and compliments. The proceedings concluded with a cup of tea. Edward allegedly signaled his active endorsement of Hitler's ambitions to acquire territories in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, as well as Germany's increasingly aggressive foreign policy, according to other scholars. There is indisputable evidence that the ex-king made no effort to dissuade the Germans from pursuing expansion. Following the conclusion of the meeting, the former monarch and the German chancellor parted ways with a reciprocal display of the Nazi salute. Unsurprisingly, there has been considerable controversy surrounding the question of what may or may not have been discussed in Germany during the Windsor's visit, particularly during Edward's encounters with Hitler, Goering, and others. Certain scholars have posited that the discourse deviated towards Edward's role in facilitating an alliance between Britain and Germany, while Germany expanded its influence across the continent and thwarted the advancement of communism. The subsequent destruction of the minutes from the October 22 meeting between Adolf Hitler and Edward has contributed to the growth of these theories. What was inside him that justified the complete destruction? Additional evidence is subjective in nature. For example, on the last evening of their tour, the Windsors were hosted in Munich by Ilse, the wife of longtime private secretary Adolf Hess and Hitler. Rudolf and Edward vanished for approximately an hour at one point, abandoning their interpreters and the remainder of the personnel. After an hour, they were discovered upstairs. Edward purportedly viewed Rudolf's collection of model ships. However, this may not have been the case. Rather, Edward may have been privy to more sinister matters. Although there is considerable scholarly debate regarding the journey, biographers of Edward and historians of the royals in the middle of the 20th century have reached a consensus that it revealed the former king's shocking lack of judgment, a fact that has damned his life forever. Furthermore, its duration did not conclude with the Windsors' departure from Germany on October 23, 1937. As will be demonstrated, throughout the Second World War, there was a proliferation of new rumors and concerns that Edward and Wallace did nothing to dispel. After their sojourn in Germany, Edward and Wallace reinstated themselves in Paris, where during the late 1930s they resided in a rented mansion situated on Boulevard Suchet. As the Germans established themselves in that region, they escalated their aggression on the international stage. During their 1937 visit to Germany, Hitler exerted increasing pressure on Austria to incorporate it into a Berlin-led political union. In March 1938, the Anschluss, which sought to establish Greater Germany, was ultimately successful, albeit in contravention of the Versailles Treaty. In a matter of weeks, Hitler advocated for the annexation of the Sudetenland, a predominantly German-populated region in western Czechoslovakia. Britain and France yielded to Hitler's demands at a conference held in Munich in September 1938, but insisted that any additional Nazi expansion efforts at the expense of Germany's neighbors would lead to war. Hitler called that bluff when he annexed the remainder of Czechoslovakia and the Baltic state city of Memel in the spring of 1939. Beginning in September 1939, however, when German tanks crossed the border into Poland, appeasement was no longer permissible. Following the outbreak of the Second World War 2 days later, both Britain and France declared war. The former monarch and his wife in France, similar to the rest of the nation, must have anticipated an imminent German invasion. Nevertheless, as autumn gave way to winter and 1940 broke, Poland had already been occupied by the Germans and there had been no westward advance. As a consequence, there was widespread speculation regarding the war's futility. This optimism was dashed for Europe by the spring. The Nazis invaded Denmark and strategically occupied Norway's major cities and municipalities in April 1940. A few weeks later, France and the Low Countries were enlisted in an invasion. This action sparked renewed apprehensions regarding Edward, whom some British diplomats accused of disclosing information to Berlin that had enabled the German advance on Belgium. In late May, when the British expeditionary force to France became ensnared in the town of Dunkirk due to the unanticipated success of the German two-pronged assault on Belgium and northeastern France. This accusation was particularly incriminating. An audacious amphibious rescue operation was the only thing that averted the destruction or capture of hundreds of thousands of British soldiers. However, the French were not so fortunate. On June 14, 1940, the Nazis occupied Paris. France as a whole and the city would continue to be governed by the Germans for the following 4 years. The Duke and Duchess, despite their previous amicability towards the Nazis, fell victim to a plot orchestrated by Hitler and the SS, a Nazi paramilitary organization, during the summer of 1940. Operation Willy, which was codenamed, aimed to apprehend the Windsors, who had departed from Paris during the May 1940 French invasion, proceed south to Biarritz, and then cross the border into Spain in order to reach Portugal. While traversing Spain, which was amicable to Hitler's government during the fascist dictatorship of General Francisco Franco, the idea for Operation Willy was conceived. The plan was to abduct and transport the Duke to Germany, where his purported pro-German leanings would be encouraged in preparation for his re-establishment as King of England after the German defeat of Britain in the war. By the time preparations reached a sophisticated stage, the Windsors had already traversed into Portugal and had established residence in Lisbon during the initial days of July 1940. A novel strategy was devised at this moment. Edward would be duped into returning to Spain, where he would be detained. However, even the SS official in charge of the operation, Walter Schellenberg, who later became the head of Nazi foreign intelligence, admitted that the plan was absurd. Although Operation Willy did not materialize, the Windsors' presence in Lisbon and Edward and Wallace's persistent lack of tact upon their arrival there exposed them to additional accusations of traitorous activity. These accusations, similar to those that accompanied their 1937 visit to Germany, have generated enduring suspicions that remain unresolved to this day. It appears that in May 1940, the Windsors made the decision to travel to Spain and Portugal due to concerns regarding their reduced social standing in Britain and the potential tax liabilities they would be subject to if they returned home. This failure to return to England appeared extremely bleak in Britain, and the newly installed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, regarded it with particular disapproval. The situation became even more dubious when the Windsors arrived in Portugal and immediately accepted an offer to stay at the residence of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker with substantial business ties in Germany who had been opened a dossier by the British intelligence service MI6 on suspicion of having adequate connections with Hitler and the Nazis. It is possible that Edward and Wallace were not informed of this, but it is highly improbable. By agreeing to remain with Santo, the former king was either engaged in negotiations with Santo or was behaving in an extremely irresponsible fashion, virtually guaranteeing that his allegiance would be called into question. Unfortunately, the situation became even worse. Recent research has unveiled that Edward, while in Portugal, advocated via Ricardo Espírito Santo that the Nazis bomb Britain into peace. It appears that Edward intended for the Nazis to employ a strategic approach involving aerial bombing over England, with a specific focus on London, to coerce the British government into capitulation without resorting to a land invasion. In essence, the Germans implemented this tactic during the summer of 1940, which culminated in the Blitz of London and England the following year. This recent research demonstrates that while in Portugal, Edward proposed the Blitz, and that the German ambassador in Lisbon subsequently relayed the same counsel to the Nazi government in Berlin. While Edward might have considered this a compromise in comparison to a land invasion, it is indisputable that this counsel constituted the gravest form of treason if it originated from a member of the royal family. Tens of thousands of bombs were released on Britain in the months that followed, resulting in the deaths of approximately 40,000 civilians. Almost every night in September and October 1940, London was subjected to bombings. Edward presumably endorsed the notion that Berlin ought to implement this approach as a means to coerce the nation into submission and re-establish his monarchy over Great Britain following the capitulation. Edward's potential deceit during his brief sojourn in Portugal did not conclude with his departure. Churchill took immediate action to remove Edward from continental Europe and prevent his return to Britain upon his and Wallace's arrival. He was unable to permit the Duke to reside on the continent and potentially fall into the clutches of the Nazis. At this juncture, the likelihood that he would conspire with the Nazis in order to potentially negotiate a deal to regain the throne of England was impracticable. Concurrently, Edward's deeds of escape to Portugal and visit to Germany in 1937 rendered him an impediment to his repatriation to England. Churchill therefore had a statement regarding Edward's appointment as the new governor of the Bahamas, a British island colony located north of Cuba, dispatched to Lisbon. Edward ultimately agreed to the position, and on August 1, 1940, he embarked on a voyage from Portugal with Wallace aboard the steamship Excalibur. 2 weeks, however, after departing Portugal, Edward participated in what was arguably his most damning conduct to date. He requested that Espírito Santo, his and Wallace's Portuguese host, relay a telegram on August 15 requesting that he do so as soon as he was able to take action. Edward disregarded the significance of this document when it was made public in 1957. However, there appears to be indication that Edward desired to be informed of any developments by a known German agent that could result in his return to Europe and installation as a puppet king of England should Germany defeat Britain in the war. As a result of the substantial suspicions surrounding the actions of Edward and his wife over the preceding years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation monitored their spring 1941 trip from the Bahamas to the United States at the direction of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, acted on information provided by a German friar residing in the United States. The monk claimed to have knowledge that Wallis Simpson had been romantically involved with the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, during his tenure as the Nazi ambassador to Britain in 1936. An additional English source of information sparked suspicions by asserting that Edward had reached an agreement with Hermann Göring in which, should Germany emerge victorious in the war, Göring would attempt to depose Hitler and install Edward as King of England. It is extremely difficult to determine how much of this was based on solid information and how much was the irrational speculation of FBI informants. However, the fact that Edward and Wallace were followed by FBI agents during their initial visit to Florida from the Bahamas in 1941 and on multiple occasions after the United States entered the war in December 1941 demonstrates the concern that surrounded them during the war years. In regards to Edward's dealings with the Nazis, it may be impossible to distinguish between fact and fiction. However, one thing is certain: any conspiracy he may have been involved in failed to materialize. Conversely, between the autumn of 1940 and the conclusion of World War II in 1945, Edward and Wallace were predominantly based in the Bahamas, a locality that Edward disparagingly characterized as a third-rate colony. Due to his disdain for the indigenous population, whom he perceived as racially subordinate to their colonial masters, he could have been considered the most unsuitable candidate to have been entrusted with the responsibility of quelling significant uprisings that broke out throughout the islands in the summer of 1942 over inadequate wages. However, Edward managed these situations diplomatically and implemented a policy of inadequate relief and public works as governor of the island in an effort to develop the islands and appease discontent with imperial rule. However, both he and Wallace were anxious to depart from what they perceived to be a colonial backwater to which they had been exiled. The former king resigned his commission as governor of the island archipelago in mid-March 1945, months before the end of the war. As Edward and Wallace resided in the Bahamas and were pursued by FBI agents in the United States, the tide of war began to turn against the Germans. Late in 1940, Hitler made the strategic decision to halt his endeavors to subjugate Britain in favor of redirecting his focus towards the Soviet Union. The commencement of an unprecedentedly extensive military campaign occurred during the summer of 1941. The German Third Reich attained its pinnacle during that winter, when German forces advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad. However, they were unable to capture the cities, and by 1942, Russian resistance on the Eastern Front had rendered the conflict hopeless. Subsequently, Germany's position progressively deteriorated due to depleting resources, the United States' admission into the war in late 1941, the influence of the Soviet Union's infinitely superior manpower, and the Eastern Front. The Russians had pushed the Germans back towards Poland and Ukraine by the summer of 1943, while the Western Allies had opened a successful new front in southern Italy. Upon the Western Allies' establishment of the Western Front in France during the summer of 1944, the decisive factor was whether the Soviets from the east or the British and Americans from the west would advance to Berlin first. The Russians ultimately prevailed, while the Western Allies occupied southern and western Germany. The conclusion of the conflict occurred in early May 1945, shortly after Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. Edward was not underminingly criticized by the British press in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, notwithstanding the numerous unresolved inquiries that persisted regarding his actions during and in the years preceding the war. However, both he and Wallace expressed a distinct desire to resume the arrangement that had been established during the late 1930s. They would reside in France again, avoiding the potentially problematic presence that their presence in Britain could cause. Despite re-establishing themselves in Paris during the reconstruction of Europe, an additional challenge emerged, providing Edward with the opportunity to resume his schemes. Early in life, his brother King George VI was afflicted with poor health as a result of his chronic smoking. The imminent risk of his demise or resignation had become a significant concern by the mid-1940s. Edward maintained a correspondence with English individuals from a distance, during which he proposed the possibility of his return to Britain and assuming the role of regent for his young niece, Princess Elizabeth. He contended that without this opportunity, Princess Elizabeth would be susceptible to the sway of her Mountbatten in-laws. The plan ultimately failed, and George persisted until 1952, during which Elizabeth was already in her mid-20s. However, it demonstrates Edward's ceaselessly ambitious cunning that he continued to consider methods of re-entering British public life even after the disgrace that followed him after the war. Notably, he witnessed the coronation of Elizabeth II on television from Paris rather than in attendance. However, this would prove to be his final attempt in this matter. In 1952, Elizabeth achieved success and embarked on an extended and prosperous tenure. In that year, her uncle and his spouse accepted a life confined to Paris. A peculiar celebrity combination emerged there: the ex-British monarch and his American spouse, who had significantly disrupted British politics prior to the war. In the city, they interacted with British expatriates and participated in the café society of post-war France. Edward, meanwhile, engaged in illicit currency trading to augment the family's substantial income and the financial perks that persisted as a result of the agreement reached with the British government in the late 1930s. In addition, he authored the 1951 memoir A King's Story, in which he expressed his opposition to the type of liberal politics that dominated Western Europe and North America in the post-war era. Additionally, it marked the debut of a book authored by a reigning or former monarch of England since its publication in 1688. Moreover, from the early 1950s to the mid-1950s, they increased their frequency of visits to the United States, where they engaged in social interactions with legislators and celebrities. During the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, they even paid a visit to the White House. Consequently, they emerged as a celebrity couple, albeit one that was peculiar, yet one that appeared to present no additional threat to the stability of public life in their native Britain. The relationship between Wallace and Edward remained a subject of considerable intrigue among commentators in the post-war era. Multiple individuals who had the opportunity to spend time with them in the 1950s remarked that they appeared to be extremely estranged from one another, rarely explicitly addressing each other. A peculiar dynamic prevailed between the two individuals, whose partnership had reportedly been so passionate 2 decades prior that Edward was prepared to relinquish the crown in exchange for her. During the mid-1960s, they made a temporary return to Britain, where they extensively attended royal events that commenced in 1965. Notably, they attended the funeral of Princess Marina of Kent, who was Edward's sister-in-law by virtue of her matrimonial union with his brother. It was perplexing that she was also referred to as George, the same appellation as his brother, the king, who had assumed the regnal name George despite being baptized Albert. Edward, similar to Marina, was in close proximity to the burial. As he approached his early 70s, he was confronted with an increasing array of health complications, the majority of which were attributable to his chronic smoking. While attending events in Britain during the mid-1960s, he frequently traveled to the United States to see physicians and underwent a variety of surgical procedures, most notably to alleviate his coronary issues. The prince's lifelong smoking propensity ultimately had a detrimental effect on him. Early in the 1970s, a diagnosis of throat carcinoma was made. It was terminally inoperable. During this period, he and Wallace had once again established themselves in Paris. Despite the fact that the former king's life was not long to remain, he was fortunate enough to receive a visit from his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, who happened to be on a state visit to France at the time. Edward passed away in Paris on May 28, 1972. His remains were expeditiously transferred to England, where they were interred at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, as opposed to Westminster Hall. Unexpectedly, a considerable segment of the British populace visited in the days that followed to pay their final respects to the king who had governed for a brief period of time 35 years prior. The funeral service was conducted under the presence of Queen Elizabeth, members of the royal family, and Wallis Simpson on June 5. He was subsequently interred in the Royal Mausoleum located at Frogmore. This development came as a surprise, given the considerable speculation that had surrounded Edward's burial location in Britain, if any, over the years. Like his existence, the former monarch remained a topic of political intrigue even in his demise. After his death, Edward's widow did not lead a prosperous existence. Wallace continued to reside in France, supported monetarily by an allowance from Queen Elizabeth and the estate of her late spouse. However, as her health deteriorated in the late 1970s, she was diagnosed with advanced dementia. In addition, her frailty and propensity for falls caused her to fracture her hip twice, and she ceased to have the ability to speak around 1980. As a result, she spent the majority of her later years confined to her home, and her mental faculties rapidly declined. To further complicate matters, Suzanne Blum, Wallace's French attorney, was exploiting her by assuming power of attorney for the increasingly incapacitated client. Blum leveraged her position to financially exploit Simpson. After 89 years of age, Wallace ultimately passed away in Paris on April 24, 1986. A few days later, St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle hosted her funeral. Despite encountering numerous challenges and generating numerous controversies, her matrimonial union with Edward endured the test of time, and she was interred in close proximity to him in the vicinity of Windsor Castle. King Edward VIII was among the most contentious individuals in the public sphere of modern Britain. He ascended to the thrones of Britain and India in 1936 and his early 40s, respectively, while he was still a bachelor. Despite being unmarried and devoid of an heir, he maintained a diverse romantic history. Indeed, such was the issue. In addition to his extensive social life during his reign as Prince of Wales in the 1920s and 1930s, the new king's numerous affairs with married women generated pervasive rumors. One of these individuals posed an immediate challenge during his limited reign. Edward was enamored with Wallis Simpson, an American who had previously undergone a divorce and would be required to do so once more in order to wed him, by 1934. It quickly became apparent that the couple had intended to do precisely that, sparking a national controversy. Since then, there has been considerable scholarly discourse regarding whether Edward was compelled to abdicate at the end of 1936 due to the fact that Simpson was a multiple divorcée, or if Simpson's unpopularity in political and social circles was the true motive and he was used as a scapegoat in order to make way for the considerably more respectable George VI. Regardless of the reasoning, the outcome remained unchanged. With his abdication, Edward became the monarch with the shortest reign in almost 5 centuries. Had the situation been resolved at that juncture, Edward might be regarded as a sympathetic individual in retrospect, having had his title revoked due to outmoded perspectives on matrimonial ethics and religion that were prevalent during the 1930s. However, what ensued irreparably damaged his reputation. Edward, who had always harbored sympathies towards the Nazi regime that had emerged in Germany in 1933, embarked on a tour of the country during the autumn of 1937. During this journey, he encountered abhorrent figures including Adolf Hitler, Hermann Göring, and Joseph Goebbels. Edward undoubtedly supported fascism as a safeguard against socialism throughout Europe. It is unknown what conspiracies may have been formulated in 1937. However, it is evident that following the Nazis' swift conquest of France, Edward and Wallace's adoptive country, in 1940, the couple became entangled with Nazi agents throughout Western Europe in the months that followed. Was Edward attempting to reclaim the throne of Britain in a Europe dominated by the Nazis? Edward irreparably tarnished his reputation as the potential traitor monarch by behaving in the manner in which he did and by subjecting himself to the slanders that he did. While certainty cannot be guaranteed, this much is certain. In your opinion, what is King Edward VIII? Is it true that he conspired as openly with Adolf Hitler and the German Nazi Party as was widely believed, or was he merely an individual who enjoyed provoking controversy? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.